I would like to introduce Joe. I don't think that he needs much of an introduction because he's a SCI-Arc. He is a SCI-Arc person. Joe, actually, he studied at SCI-Arc. I'm not going to say what year, but he's a SCI-Arc alumni. He's also the principal of Dig Day Design. He has been teaching at SCI-Arc for a long time, so in and out between seminars and studios. So you will always see him, at least one semester a year. But also his presence that you don't see because he's also part of the board of SCI-Arc. So his influence in the school not only carries on in the way that you see us, professors, but he's also in the behind-the-scenes operations of the school. So he has been fantastic and a great supporter of everything that has been happening in the school in the last 10 years. He's kind of the new SCI-Arc. I thought it was important for you guys to see this lecture or to see his work. And I took it as an opportunity that he is organizing and finishing up an exhibition. When is it opening? June 3rd. There's going to be an exhibition of the diagrams that you see in the library. So I think that it was a good moment for him to show us the preparation for that exhibition, and also to show you how these diagrams are prepared. So the history of the diagrams is something that he takes on. It's something that belongs within the discipline of architecture. More specifically, and unfortunately, Charles Shanks is not coming to lecture, but you can, maybe in a later moment. Are you showing some of his diagrams? Yeah. So he'll tell you the long story, but it really comes from a tradition of understanding theory in architecture and also practice. He kind of couples the understanding between theory and practice in a way that you can kind of map the relevance of the discipline at different moments. And we saw it in thesis prep. One thing that is important for you guys is the way in which you look at information and how are you able to situate your interest somewhere within the complex map of the history of architecture, even the present of architecture. So this large amount of information it's gathered within each one of these diagrams. So the diagrams, in a way, what they do is that they start to kind of catalog information. So they start to catalog offices, influences, tendencies, kind of operations. So it's like, how can you catalog everything that goes along the type of work that different offices do? How close, how far apart they are. And of course, you can make your own interpretations, and we will open to questions afterwards. But also how each of you, in a way, can do your own diagram. Like this is definitely his view on the cosmology, let's say, of the kind of field of architecture. But I think that each student at some point in the book will have to have a version of these diagrams. You will have to have your own view of how you see the things that you find interesting. It's important also that you kind of find yourself within the diagram. So where do you start to see yourself within the kind of analysis that Joe does? I think it's also interesting. Are you more, well, now I see, I'm not sure which diagram will be, so what are the elements that you find interesting, and almost using his diagrams as a departure point to see where to start searching. Another thing I think is important is that you will see a lot of information that he will give you, from office names to art examples, to culture, to politics, to philosophy. Joe is a little bit like a humanist. He's an old school academic that not only knows the niche of architecture, but he really can engage with all of the artistic disciplines. So, he's really, any questions that you need in regard to any artist, I'll give you his email. So anyway, so with that broad introduction, thank you, Sho, for coming, and enjoy. You have your word.
Florencia, thank you for having me, and thank all of you for showing up on a Thursday evening. I know it's a little out of studio cycle. This, for me, is a really welcome opportunity to kind of review a little of what we've been going through in my studio to get ready for the show this summer, kind of at that better than halfway mark of putting together the material for that, and to actually take a look at some of those, but also to think, I wanted to take this opportunity to review how diagrams have informed our practice, the degree to which I often explain diagramming in my own life as sort of a nervous tick. Like when deadlines or opportunities arise, often one of the first things I do in a state of panic is try to kind of figure out what the parameters could be and how I could organize them so they start to kind of inform one another. And I have to say on this one, I'm thrilled to be here. This is documented a little more carefully than I was anticipating. I'd really like to keep this a discussion. I think that's more useful for you, and certainly more comfortable for me if this is, if we treat this as more of a working session than a tryout for Khan Academy, which it's feeling like. But in any case, we'll get into this a little bit. This, for what it's worth, and you may or may not, it's interesting how much this does and does not apply to Thesis at SCI-Arc anymore. But this was a diagram I put together around 2000. And it was, as all of these diagrams are in one way or to one degree or another, sort of diagnostic. And the issue then amongst faculty was that Thesis actually wasn't generating very many proposals for buildings. That you'd walk the halls during Thesis and you'd see a lot of environments, you'd see specific objects, furniture, actually this entire kind of bandwidth of possibilities, but a relatively limited number of final end games that arrived either at a project or what I've called a methodological investigation there. And for what it's worth, and really for better or for worse, I think Thesis has been rebalanced radically towards the end of those. I'd be mildly surprised, given how the last few years of Thesis have worked, if most of you don't end up with a lot of work headed towards what could be.
Pointer if you want.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. This is another real, oh, awesome. It's a color I can see. I'm red-green colorblind. But yeah, these were, SCI-Arc historically generated a lot of strange things around Thesis. And it got stranger and stranger, and I think for many of us that started teaching here around 2000, it seemed to get strange to a point of no longer necessarily charging the question of what architecture could be in a valuable way. I bring it up in part because I think we might actually be swinging back. There might have, I think you guys might be at the end of an overcorrection the other direction. So I'm hoping maybe some oddities, but we'll see. In any case, there are a few here that are very SCI-Arc specific. Let me see if I've got, there we go. There are a few diagrams that are SCI-Arc specific, but most of them range across our field in, across contemporary architecture and a bit further back than that, contemporary art. And most of the teaching I've done here over the last 5 years or so has had to do with art and architecture. And many of them, in fact, almost all the diagrams I'm going to show you today are what I would talk about as exograms, as maps or cartographic studies, diagrams that give you a sense of general orientation within the field, or actually sort of reparcel a field or a combination of fields so that, around your interests, possibly, I think for all of you around your thesis. And this has partly to do with the material we're headed for in June, but I hope for you guys it's good timing in terms of where you're at in the thesis cycle. And if I'm not mistaken, you're sort of halfway through the thesis prep semester going into summer of thesis. So I think now that more general order of diagramming probably is what you guys are asking yourselves and being asked for. At some point, I actually think you will shift profoundly into what I think of as the other order of diagramming, which are operational diagrams, the kind of internal diagrams that are often specific to a single project, or more often to a kind of ongoing project within an office. So I would say most of the practices I respect most, I could understand as the ongoing evolution of what I'm calling here an endogram, or a diagram of architectonic exploration that builds on itself and would find specific instances of realization in specific projects. But these are two traditions. For tonight, I'm going to try to at least make them plausible as a kind of dialectic in how we discuss architecture. I think there's another conversation about how they could merge or inform one another that actually is a big part of the contemporary architectural debate, especially actually kind of in the wake of Rem Koolhaas. But we'll get there. To kind of set up the more historical terms of debate, though, I'd offer these two examples of the exo and endo diagram. Cubism and Abstract Art is a famous version of Alfred Barr's diagram for the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. He produced a series of these through the 1920s. I think this one's from 1926. And as you can see, he's mapped all of the major modernist avant-gardes in terms of their influences on one another, in terms of a temporal sequence from top to bottom we get later into the 20th century. And basically what Barr is trying to do here is at least twofold. He's trying to make sense of a lot of diverse works of art that are coming into that museum's collection very quickly in the 20s, and just trying to figure out how you sort them, actually how you might sort them spatially into departments, what they actually have to do with one another. But there's also a kind of profound politics to this kind of representation, and part of this is to establish that through their interconnection and the kind of sequence of influences, these modern movements that seemed so one-off and kind of simply provocative for their own sake in many respects, were interconnected and formed a kind of body of knowledge that New York and Museum of Modern Art in particular, and New York and the art world in general needed to actually understand as, if not a unified whole, as a profoundly competitive and interrelated set of discourses. By contrast with that, I've included, and there will be those of you in here that can call me on this, this actually is not Corbusier's 5 points, but a reinterpretation of it in the 30s that became more specific to a series of projects. It was sort of the 5 after 5, and frankly, the version of the 5 points I found just wasn't holding up graphically. But in any case, I like this one in part because it's more clearly about Corbusier figuring out how to solve specific building problems. He's using his initial 5 points of pilotis and clearing the ground plane, lifting the garden to the roof, all the strip windows. Those 5 points here are becoming operational strategies for how, or operational tactics within larger strategies for how you actually break down building mass, how you solve a specific architectural problem. And I think it was in that interpretation of Corbusier's initial 5 points that you really see the beginning of our discussion of 20th century architecture, especially the American formalist tradition is incredibly indebted to Corbusier, to this kind of the set of mechanics and transformations that he proposes through that kind of diagramming, what I'm again calling here an endo diagram. I'm going to stick here mostly with exo, and exogenous means outside the specific, endo would be endogenous or involuted or inward-looking. But I think probably the most famous exo diagram of the post-war period is Charles Jenks's 20th century diagram. And this too he reworked a few times, but in this version you see the 20th century marching from left to right and actually continuing to 2010, just for a sense of scale. And actually this was published about here. So this is from, in fact, he is doing versions of them as early as the late 60s. everything you see for the next 40 years is Charles Jenks actually predicting how things might play out. And I'd invite you to just look at some of those terms towards the end and see how prescient he was. He calls some he made some incredibly early and accurate calls about what might be possible and what the different strands of architectural inquiry might be. I mean, biomorphic is big enough for me to read from here, but quite a few of those are interestingly attuned to how the next 30 or 40 years would play out. And I bring this up in part because this diagram comes up amongst architects often, and I think its basic kind of biomorphism against the grid, its compositional strengths are perennially enticing to certain people, but I actually think it's held up because he was right so much of the time. But as right as he was, a lot of people find this appalling. The idea of kind of quantifying the field in this way, labeling everything and anything under the sun. There are many, many approaches to architecture that find exactly this kind of, what I'll talk about later as nominalism, this kind of incessant naming of things as deeply problematic in its own right. And each of you, I think, will need to make some decisions about how useful that is to you, and or how kind of offended you are by it. And it can be both useful and offend you, I think. This one I know is tough to read. It's a poor scan, but this is Ad Reinhardt's family tree. It's one of a couple of family trees he did for modern art. And so he shows a trunk of Matisse, Picasso, and Braque. This is basically a cartoon of the canon of modern art. And this, in some ways, was in answer to Alfred Barr's timeline I showed you earlier. This is very much Ad Reinhardt, a conceptual artist in New York in the 60s and 70s, trying to find his way out from under the kind of legitimating heaviness of Alfred Barr and Philip Johnson and the Museum of Modern Art, and what by the 60s had become a dauntingly exclusive modernist establishment versus what would be the post-war contemporary art scene. He did a few of these. I think this one has a shoe hanging off it and a dead weight. In later versions of this, branches start to get lopped off, meaning they ain't gonna make it. But Ad Reinhardt's an interesting character in terms of artists you might want to check out in the thesis. Well, this would be another map of the arts in New York. This was a family tree of hip hop from the late 90s, published, I think, in Time or Newsweek magazine. Actually, I should know because I actually had to pay the rights to publish this. I think some of these playas are still in effect. But what I'm getting at here for you guys is, or what I'd point out about both this one and this one, is their logic of composition. So they are literally trees. And they are trees in which a central trunk, and they're trees in which the soil is understood to be where a movement starts. The trunk is generally the strongest and earliest proponents of a new sensibility, and then the branches represent a diversification from the ideas of that kind of inaugural avant-garde. And a lot of contemporary art and architecture is often kind of understood in terms of that basic figure of historical growth and expansion. This was, and there were a couple late additions here in terms of slides, and this is one of them. This was what I did when I was your age, which was actually in 1994, to answer Florencia's question. When I was in thesis prep, I had actually spent a lot of my 2 earlier years at SCI-Arc obsessed with a family of artists. Roberto Matta on the left and Gordon Matta Clark on the right are both remarkable characters in different ways. Roberto Matta was a surrealist painter who had worked for Corbusier, was lured away from his office by André Breton and Salvador Dali, and wrote treatises against Corbusier through the 40s, and then produced this incredible body of paintings called Inscapes in the 40s and 50s that were arguably one of the last great bodies of surrealist painting. Gordon Matta Clark, one of his twin sons, born in 1943 to Anne Clark, Similarly, studied architecture. Roberto Mata had studied in Chile before moving to Europe. Gordon Mata Clark studied architecture at Cornell with the New York Five. The direct heirs of Corbusian modernism, and similarly met Robert Smithson in his last year in college, helped him produce an earthwork at Cornell, and left architecture for fine art, and became, as I hope some of you are familiar with, in fact, Gordon Mata Clark tends to be the more familiar character in architecture schools. He became very famous for slicing buildings. Splitting, he sliced a building in New Jersey in half. He then did more and more elaborate borings through buildings before he died tragically at 37, cancer. Roberto Mata actually just passed away recently. I was trying to figure out what led these two in and out of architecture, what critique of modernism they actually represented, because they clearly weren't exactly postmodern. They were something else. And they were actually, in certain respects, running to the left of, to a radical extreme of what was the kind of mainstream radicality of their time. And what I stumbled into was a pair of influences that I think were very important for them. Piranesi, up at the top, is the only architect that the two of them would speak positively about later in their careers as artists. The only architect they remained interested in after leaving the field was Giovanni Piranesi. And it was the Carcieri and these weird spatial fields that he was interested in. But the one that really shaped both of them in important ways was Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp was a family friend. He helped Roberto Mata move to New York. Gordon Mata Clark was famously bounced on his knee. He got the Museum of Modern Art to buy one of Roberto Mata's first canvases. Huge figure in that family, and as I'll make clear here, I think an important one philosophically for what they were trying to do vis-a-vis both their field of fine art and architecture. I'm not going to inflict my entire thesis on you tonight. But what I did, once I had established that core of four figures, I started looking at their shared interests and overlaps in technique. These are two of about eight overlay diagrams I did to kind of chart how they might or might not have something to do with one another. And I ended up with a kind of ancillary field of characters as well that were somehow tied up in this. And I offer this, I think you guys, and I don't know if it's still the case in thesis prep, but there was the frenemies exercise for many years. Not anymore. I'm way behind. Right. One way or the other, I mean, I could be mistaken, but my guess is sometime this semester you're going to look around at whose work you hope your work could be in dialogue with, who you're building on or reacting against, or whatever your stance is towards the work. I think now would be the time to start imagining it in dialogue with what people have done in some direction in our field, or if you want to argue it in a neighboring one. And this was my attempt to this was sort of the beginnings of a battle plan for me, for my thesis, really. And that's as much on my thesis as I'm going to inflict on you tonight, though I'd be more than happy to talk to you more about that. I got out of school on time, and this was a kind of meditation on small-scale architecture practice in LA a few years out of school, and incidentally, the year I met Florencia and Hernan and Marcelo and Georgina, who moved out. This is all right around 2000. This is from 2002. And I often explain this diagram as the diagram over which many of my friendships at SCI-Arc were founded. It also charts, it's about 100 practices, and the Los Angeles Forum of Architecture and Urban Design asked over 15 years, would ask small practices every summer to come talk about their work. And the practical necessity for this diagram was to organize those practices for an anthology of that organization. So I didn't sit down and decide I was going to sort 100 LA practices. It was unlike the one I just showed you, I didn't make this problem up for myself. But what I stumbled on in looking at LA architect, or LA, the question, and this is an important thing with a good diagram. A good diagram starts with a provocative, or at least a haunting question. And the kind of basic question underlying this one was, why has Los Angeles hosted such a fruitful contemporary architecture scene when so many cities don't? Like what made this city different in the second half of actually for most of the 20th century, but especially the second half? Why were so many practices able to establish new possibilities here? And my argument was that basically you start with Neutra and Schindler and this initial dialectic, the kind of defining modernist dialectic in LA was between Neutra and Schindler, as Ray talked about last night, between steel and wood and between how modernism after Wright here was going to get interpreted and what you could do with it. And I think a lot of LA practices are still in that central column of kind of arguing that set of questions. I won't talk about every diagram tonight in this kind of depth, and most of them aren't this. This one got away from me. But what happened in the 1960s and 70s is that things started to diversify in interesting ways, and SCI-Arc is both evidence and a driver of that diversification. And so in the 1960s and 70s, you get Ray Caffey here, and you get early Frank Gehry and the emerging LA school starting actually to take the Schindlerian informal side of the modernist dialectic in directions that it couldn't kind of have seen coming. And out of that emerges a different set of kind of axial possibilities that have to do with how art and architecture relate, and especially with this whole question of process. You could not be in any of the buildings SCI-Arc has occupied for more than 10 minutes for most of the life of this school without hearing the fucking word process. It was an echo through this place. That is what SCI-Arc has actually explored endlessly and to many people myopically through its entire existence. And this quad to the left was about that focused diversification of what contemporary architecture in LA could mean. To the right was something that emerged a little later. I think in the late 70s and early 80s, you start to see actually you see the Neutrian interest in technology really becoming, kind of developing a kind of departure velocity of its own. And there, the criteria are a little bit different, and there's a looser sense of what people are chasing, but basically there's an interest in modeling technology either through a kind of literal representation of mechanization, and Wes Jones would have been an emblematic character in that respect, or in terms of a more generic notion of complexity. Of kind of a more abstract notion, almost a kind of Corbusian notion of technology smoothing things out in the complex and the simple. In any case, there's a quad that develops out of there that most of my new friends at SCI-Arc fell into and were happy to be. And I bring up this because later we're going to see diagrams a little like this for the current faculty here. And actually, I think the migratory ambitions might be the opposite. But in those years, in the early 2000s, people my age really wanted to be over there and not there. I think things may have moved. Whatever they wanted to do, they probably didn't want to be here. They didn't want to be in the pragmatic spectrum. And these practices in the practices in that spectrum across the bottom of this diagram are marked by a few, they're err less to Neutra and Schindler and more to Irving Gill. Irving Gill was, I hope he's familiar to most of you, especially if you're from San Diego or points further south. He was an incredibly prolific, really, really elegant, careful modernist who brought a kind of modest modernism to Southern California and wasn't necessarily above incorporating a Spanish roof line or an arched window if he had to. He was accommodating. And he was prolific and successful. And there are a whole lot of practices in LA that through the 20th century have actually built really sound, competent, responsible practices kind of from that point of departure. So when you get out of here, sadly, about at least a dozen of the practices, this is from 2002, and I couldn't really figure out how to update it now. About a dozen of these practices are either elsewhere or not. This is one I'm actually working on right now with Thomas Donnell, who's been a critic here a bit and turns out to be a staggering expert on contemporary Japanese architecture, and almost certainly the defining expert on contemporary Japanese architecture in English. And he's been helping me sort out he's been helping me sort out the different lineages and interests in Japanese architecture, in contemporary Japanese architecture. And what this does more than anything, just in terms of the logic of development, you have, on the vertical, you have who worked for who, or who studied under who, up and down. So Toyo Ito is a student of Shinohara, and Seishima and Nishizawa and Nishiyama all worked for him on the vertical, and then you get the generational commonalities in the horizontal. The horizontal ovals pick up the people who are within a few years of, and it turns out, and for better or for worse, and you might want to check this out, but in Japan, you really wanted to be born kind of every 15 or 17 years. Like, it's incredible how much there's a watershed with a really predictable rhythm to it and not a lot in between. And I think a lot of it has to do with the economy. It has to do with, you know, a set of questions that recur. In any case, that's sort of, there's actually more gridding to this circle than is immediately apparent. But the figure that I was most interested in, starting into this, actually was Isozaki. And there's a diagonal oval in here that sort of breaks the rules of those generations and kind of inheritances. But it is fundamentally a timeline, and I want to enforce that because there's another kind of diagram that's important and I think useful for you guys. Has anybody, by a show of hands, have any of you guys seen this diagram before? Cool. Okay, good. Got at least a sound minority. This is Rosalind Krauss's sculpture in the expanded field diagram from 1976. Comes out within months of Charles Jenks's 20th century. This is the other hugely important diagram for the discussion of contemporary art, and I would argue for the discussion of either of our disciplines in the last 30 years. This was Rosalind Krauss's attempt to look at the work going on in her field as artists were leaving galleries in New York and going off and doing strange things in the middle of nowhere, like Robert Smithson's Earthworks and the performance pieces that were happening simultaneously. And a whole variety of ways of working with landscape as the medium of contemporary art, which simply hadn't happened before. This was her way of starting to sort out that work into a variety of genre that you could assess with some degree of clarity. And the whole article that accompanies this begins with a discussion of just how kind of muddy the water is, how hard it is to make sense of all this work that won't get anywhere near a white gallery wall for you to even look at it and think about it. And so this was her attempt and this is an important thing to note about diagrams of all varieties, but especially these exodiagrams. They are systems of discipline, and they are ways people try to bring phenomena into rhyme and reason, and often there's a real kind of coercion to it. This is a provocative diagram in the art world, and there have been a whole series of. Actually, I'm going to skip this for a second and go to a riff on Rosalind Krauss's diagram. So this is by an artist named Sam Durant in 1999, and this was Durant's. A lot of 20 years later, by the 90s, artists actually felt hemmed in by Rosalind Krauss's system for understanding contemporary post-gallery art, and so you end up with kind of plays on it like this that kind of that basically are created to relate, Kurt Cobain to the Stones. But this one was a diagram I put together a few years ago for a course on art and architecture. It actually is contemporary art for architects. And it was a riff. It was a play on Rosalind. It was a play on the expanded field, but it was also an attempt to try to figure out. I spent a lot of time thinking about the axes of this diagram and how to set it up so that the quadrants would start to fill out with work that somehow seemed beyond the utility of her expanded field diagram. And so in this diagram, on the horizontal, the gestural to emblematic horizon of this diagram has a lot to do with contemporary painting. So if the emblematic would have to do with pop and with the easily identifiable kind of signifier sign in the painting, that's opposed on the left to the gestural or abstract expressionist or all the kind of expressionisms and kind of freezings of gesture and motion that categorize that a lot of art kind of relies on. On the vertical, I tried to come up with a set of dyads that had to do with conceptualism and minimalism. So on the north end, distillation really is a generic kind of minimalist impulse to strip and simplify the object, where demystification has to do with the conceptual project of trying to make art that somehow explains something about itself, something about the art world, something about the larger world. But most conceptual art has to do with a process of revealing the inner workings of some. Thanks. You should wire and go faster. There aren't that many slides. I'm good. Oh, if I walk and talk. It's funny, this is the most people I've spoken to in over a year, so I'm pleased that I got out from behind the podium once. I struggle, and in fact, part of my intermittent teaching, I have huge crowd phobias, and so anyway, I won't burden you with those. But actually, I think it has to do with my diagramming. Diagramming is how I make sense of crowds. Let's see here. So this, and we're at more than the halfway point, I promise. But this is actually a first pass I took. Actually, Florencia, this was what I sent Cynthia when you and Mark asked me to do a diagram for log a few years ago. It made me think for the first time about how the diagrams get structured and what the technique for diagramming, what my technique for diagramming might be. And what I've tried to give you here, and I hope this is useful, any or all of these in whatever variety of you want, these are all different ways of mapping large bodies of information. So the first one on top is a simple timeline in which T for time marches either across page or down page, and another variable is played against it on the other axis. A similar one, and this actually, a lot of trees are in some ways, when I do a tree, I don't do a trunk and then branches coming up usually. I do a trunk kind of in the center. I do it in plan. And that kind of radial diagramming, does this work? Am I still with you? This kind of radial diagramming is, in a certain sense, a kind of a genealogical tree in plan rather than an elevation. But there are many, many sort of interesting variables you can do. This one, and there's nothing to really see there, but that's one of Ebenezer Howard's urban diagrams for how cities evolve or could evolve. It's actually an entire utopia built into that figure. The one in the middle actually maps the weather patterns in Israel over the course of a year. And the final one over there is Mike Davis's urban diagram for LA in Ecology of Fear, which is really worth a look. It's very, very, very funny. But in any case, those kind of urban target diagrams, I borrow a fair amount from the art world to try to kind of alter how architectural questions can be framed, but urbanism also, and especially like as I was just getting out of school, I have 10 years of kind of city stuff that I now repress. But one of the things I liked about urbanism was all their weird diagrams. Worth a look. The third bar is Rosalind Krauss's expanded field. In the middle, and you can't see it, but it's worth looking up, is Frederick Jameson's diagram in the big postmodernism book that probably dates from when all of you were born, I realize. But it's worth, Postmodernism or the Logic of Late Capitalism is a book still worth your time. And he's got a great diagram there that explains postmodernism, but it diversifies postmodernism immediately into kind of pessimistic and optimistic postmodernism. Actually, people that like modernism and hate postmodernism, anyway, that one, worth a look. And then finally, the timeline, I guess the timelines and trees down here. And actually, I was looking at this today thinking, and I think it was really honestly a question of time, but Barr's diagram could have been, and probably should have been in the timelines. But I include it here in terms of the branching diagrams, because the connections between his avant-gardes were actually much more important than than just the march of time through them. Is this carrying so far? Is this making sense? Okay. All right. So this is the diagram that I was working on for Florencia and Mark Gage, and I think at the Now talk, the Now conference last year, this was kind of spinning through. And I do think this was done in 2007 or 8, somewhere in there. So there are aspects of this that don't exactly hold. But I think it's actually pedagogically maybe useful for you guys. It's a little earlier than your time, but I do think whenever I'm trying to explain these diagrams, a constant issue I have is if I have friends that are in them, they care about if they're in them and where they are. But frankly, 80% of my thought in these diagrams goes to the axes. What I care about most is what the criteria are for the different territories you're talking about. And I feel like I made a good choice with this one, which was to argue that contemporary architecture at that particular moment was really kind of bifurcated between theorists who were interested in issues that had to do with time and territory, with temporality and in Jeff Kipnis's case, performance. In Sylvia Lavin's case, the question of the contemporary or contemporaneity. In Quinter's case, actually a more complicated argument about ubiquity that goes back to a whole alternative reading of modernism and actually Einsteinian time and space relativity. So you have advanced theory in our field really obsessed with time. And you have other theorists coming out of the 90s that frankly are still interested in territory, still interested in issues of power and who claims which territory in a kind of Foucauldian way, but also just like the extent of territory, the size of things, whether architects are going to produce landscapes or not. That you actually, in the lower portion of this, and I'm down there on the lower right. And I should point out what I pointed out I joke with Florencia that every time I do a diagram with Florencia and I in it, we are almost always on opposite corners. So Florencia is up there. And frankly, this too might be a diagram where you wanted, well, the reason this diagram happened was partly, well, that was after. I was happy to publish it in Log, but it happened for Marcelo. Marcelo and Georgina curated a show called Matters of Sensation, which is a really interesting, and again, I think a good show to look up as at the cusp of Thesis as you are, that looked at the shift from digital exploration into the manifestations of early digital possibilities. And most of the people on the upper periphery of this diagram were in that show. And Marcelo asked me to kind of look at it and look at the work and try to figure it out. And what I realized was that if there was this theoretical split between time and temporality and territoriality, on the horizon for designers were very different issues. And I think fundamentally, many architects in the early 2000s, late 90s, but especially the early 2000s, were interested in modeling fluidity and the new possibilities of curvature and anyway. Like all of the ways things didn't need to be boxes anymore, but especially a kind of fluid, continuous surface based on Delanda and more distantly on 1,000 Plateaus. Thank you, on one side, and then a whole series of practices that were interested in advanced technology, interested in taking advantage of advanced technology kind of in whatever form they could get their hands on it. And so the contingency people, for a long time, that pole was just the ad hoc pole. It was people who wanted to get things realized, wanted to work with new digital tools, but were really interested in getting the tools to actually make stuff, or trying to. Basically, it was sort of, in some ways, a sort of pure and applied attitude towards new technologies. All right, so I'll give you the alternative reading here. So one of the oddities of this diagram was that all roads seem to lead back to Peter Eisenman on some levels. And I frankly do think that, American contemporary formalism is largely his, if not his brainchild. Peter Eisenman sets up a lot of the possibilities for how formalism can be explored in this country. The other question that led to this diagram was students here asking me, so why are all our teachers from New York? Like, why all these Columbia imports? Why all these people that have studied with Greg Lynn? And this diagram helped me explain that to myself. Like, this is actually why the discourse had been shaped in a certain way, and why, actually, one of the things I like about it is that the other quadrants have actually risen to, when this was done, you really wanted to be in the upper left quadrant, but the others have started to kind of find their footing. This is one, a few years ago, we did a show of houses by 40 houses, 20 by LA architects and 20 by architects in Tokyo. And this one too is I'm showing kind of for utilitarian reasons for you guys. You're going to be collecting a lot of visual material now probably to try to figure out where you want to go. And I would suggest that you start to kind of organize it maybe slide table style or something so that you begin to see the adjacencies. I look at this as sort of a diagnostic exercise for you to figure out precisely what your interests are. I think it's actually a challenge with Thesis to get past your tastes and really into your interests. And frankly, what this will give you pretty quickly is a kind of cartography of your tastes that you may want to move past. But what we did here was basically look at these. In the case of many of the Japanese architects, I wasn't familiar with them. Many of them are your age. And there's an amazingly prolific generation of Japanese architects in their late 20s and early 30s. And so really we were trying to just figure out how to key this large body of really abstract and unargued. Like, there isn't much of a tradition of, well, actually, as you go further back, there really is. But the contemporary generation in Japan doesn't feel like they need to make a case for what they're doing. They just need to kind of get it done. Anyway, that was a way to start kind of organizing your thoughts, I guess, or organizing what you're stumbling into. Excuse me. This is just a map of a dinner conversation. So, and this was last June. Jeff Kipnis and Todd Gannon and Hernan made it to Japan for a conference on Isozaki. And after a lot of flying, I went straight to dinner with Jeff, and he spent the whole night talking about artists and how they work. And I'm hoping by June I can make this actually make sense, but this was kind of at this point, a second or third pass at trying to kind of get the players straight in my own head. But the gist of it, and this could be kind of useful for you guys, was we talked a lot about, did any of you see Tim's Vermeer, a documentary a couple years ago? Last year, I think. Tim's Vermeer, yeah, you guys are too locked into showing up here on Thursdays. Tim's Vermeer was a film made about a man who decided that, are all of you familiar with Vermeer's painting? Is that a safe assumption? Okay, you need to know Vermeer. He argued that Vermeer's painting wasn't simply the kind of act of God, genius, production of a kind of unrivaled painterly imagination, but in fact was basically an exercise in environmental control and lensing, and that Vermeer had probably found a way to basically project the images of, he was very famous for these beautifully lit images of women in a very particular Dutch interior with a gridded floor. And what he really ran with was this notion of the grid on the floor, that clearly it looked like these environments were sort of more controlled than you realized. And he actually built an environment that made it possible for him, a totally unschooled, no training in painting, made it possible for him to produce a more than reasonable approximation of a Vermeer. And Jeff spent the night explaining how many artists probably have a technical innovation like that buried in their work that common art history hasn't wanted to foreground. That we would rather actually talk about their genius and their vision than their technique. And so a lot of this was about how technique is often explained as virtuosity, as genius. And then I went home back to my hotel that night, and I couldn't sleep. And the thought that generated this diagram was, but in the 20th century, neither of those things mattered as much as critique. Like the criticism and the kind of self-conscious assessment of what art could or couldn't be, especially after Marcel Duchamp, is such a huge question in the 20th century. So anyway, this whole diagram is sort of a weird, it's an argument I hope I can make. It's a counter-argument to Jeff, and we'll see if it flies. I sent him a version of this on just like by hand, and he looked and he said, "Wow, so sometimes these really don't work out, huh?" And sometimes they don't. So we're back to Charles Jenks, and here, okay, and I'm in the final cycle here, and I've kept you almost an hour. What I wanted to look at in a few examples was how these maps of generalization, these cartographic or exogrammatic maps, can serve projects, can be interpreted, or how people can use them. And the most direct way to use them is simply to make them manifest. So I would argue that in the 60s and early 70s, Charles Jenks's diagram and Archigram's graphic representations of Walking City and other utopian proposals are literally kind of graphic rhymes with one another, where one has almost been transposed into the working logic of the other. And whether you only get Jenks after this, or whether some of Archigram actually borrowed from, I actually don't know the directions of influence, but there's at least a really clear reciprocity in that particular moment between these two ways of seeing information and imagining architecture. And I think there's an important argument that I think that plays out at mid-century between Le Corbusier's idea of the diagram and making the diagram manifest. So in the Radiant City, the diagram is simply inflicted on the antique city, and the 5 points made the world, not just the single architectural project, against a very different notion of the diagram that emerged out of surrealism and out of art practice, and especially, it turns out of the kind of madcap, strange way of seeing the world that Salvador Dali brought to bear. So Salvador Dali coins the idea of the paranoid critical method. And I'm sorry I don't have this, but there's a good circular diagram of the paranoid critical method, which is like, have an idea, have blind faith in that idea, see idea fail, try, repeat, or something like that. But the paranoid critical method is sort of an interesting thing to look up if you want to. But one aspect of it, the diagram for the paranoid critical method, was that you need a combination of kind of strict, clear, solid state armature, and then you need like a random soft form, draping over that armature to actually end up with something that's doing something that hasn't happened before. That there's some combinatory logic at the heart of most innovative practice. And this was Dali's ode to New York after seeing the city in the 1940s. I love this drawing for a variety of reasons, but I include it here because I think it's so important for the Koolhausian end of the contemporary architecture debate, where to a certain degree architecture finds its radicality in enforcing architecture out of, in this case, forcing architecture into a kind of anthropomorphic translation and then back again into architecture, which has been at odds, I think, that kind of literalist, how do you make anything in the world architecture, has been at odds for my entire life with the Corbusian and even more starkly interpreted formalism of Peter Eisenman, which argues that architecture can only build on architecture, that only the basic tenets and components of architecture are kind of worthy and legitimate grounds for architectural investigation, and that it's only through distilling them down to their fundamentals and then reformulating them that you are actually challenging the limits of the field. That kind of formalism, to me, when I was your age, drove me batshit crazy. I hated the high formalist position when I was in school. I was actually happy to imagine my entire thesis as one kind of crazy anti-Corbusian, like, jihad. I have come around for a variety of reasons, but especially actually because in my lifetime, frankly, in the United States, the formalist position has often been the truly productive one. And I think it is a little bit the upside of the big technological advances we made in those years and the way formalist practices could actually expand on those discoveries. But what it's worth, there's a turn there. These are the many children of Rem and all of their, this too this actually is a sort of Jenksian timeline just for the progeny of Rem Studio as you leave school. You may want to think about who you're going to work for in terms of the kind of discourse that office creates, the kind of legacy it creates in its practitioners. And one of the things I like to say about LA architects, the office in Los Angeles that without a doubt has produced the most provocative and kind of self-propelling graduates of its inner dialogue and kind of studio milieu is Morphosis. There's not a close second, and Frank Gehry is a brilliant character, but it's very hard to find a graduate of Frank Gehry's office that doesn't simply maintain Gehry's idiom at the time they were there through their work. At Morphosis, you get people that really leave and keep asking different questions. I'm not sure I want that recorded, but anyway. Arguably Rem and certainly Eisenman and that actually part of my coming around to Eisenman was coming around to the fact that the ongoing conversation of what he would call with real precision his project is, I think, an important part of why he is so crucial. I think I'm now, oh no, okay. This is Constant, and this actually, I actually believe this is a literalized diagram, and I like it for that reason. But Constant's New Babylon is one of the least well-known of the 60s urban avant-gardes. It would be contemporary with Walking City and with Superstudio. But I actually am offering this with totally strategic goodwill here. A reference to Constant in your thesis will get you a good review. And people like Constant in part because he's sort of Rem before Rem. He was literally the Dutch guy in London before Rem, but he also had a really interesting career. He was a situationist and expelled from that avant-garde group by, I was on such a good roll for names, Guy Debord. Throws Constant out of the Situationists for actually being too interested in producing actual work. The Situationists were famous for having Derives and just walking through the cities of London and Paris, walking in and out of movie theaters, creating, refusing to be quiet, refusing to be quiet. Anyway, the Situationists are interesting in their own right, but Constant had this idea for basically collaging a continuous megalopolis through Europe. That collage is actually a map of how he thought continental Europe should be interconnected, that in many respects, some important respects, has arguably come to pass. He imagined that building up off the ground in something like this in an incredibly kind of ad hoc fashion, and it was for him to be, and he was profoundly political, he argued that we were going to get past a point of scarcity, and that soon we would be dealing not with Homo sapiens, but Homo ludens, man at play, and that this would be the kind of utopian environment where they could do whatever they wanted. And this was of a piece with Archigram's Think Belt, whatever it is. He wasn't alone in this kind of optimism, but I want to we could use more of this optimism these days. All right, and now this is the final kind of insider baseball. Do you guys have thesis advisors yet? Prep advisors, but you still have another round of choice? All right. now I'm okay. So in the diagram I showed you of Los Angeles, there was the process cross to the right and the product quad to the left. This is a little like this. And this was a year or two ago, I started to try to figure out what my colleagues at SCI-Arc were really fascinated with, what they were chasing in their work. And this is a very provisional, it has some issues, and Florenzi is wincing. But and you'll see them bigger, but it's important to understand that these are, I actually believe SCI-Arc is a fantastic school right now in the context of US architecture schools, and that it is so because there are actually two really active epistemologies for how you can chase contemporary architecture. Your basic approach to what new possibility, where to find new possibilities in our field. And I think one of them is modeled on science and the other is on philosophy. And there absolutely can be some crossbreeding between them, but I would argue that their strengths have to do with how they build on those premises internally. And so last night, the whole discussion with Ray about science architecture as SCI-Arc's premise was really interesting to me. I actually think there are a lot of people here and in LA more generally in the US that are still absolutely trying to make sense of the digital revolution and more generally in what exponential advances in technology can mean for our field since 1995, since the mid-90s or earlier. And I guess Greg would argue much earlier, but in any case, I'll start there. While there's also a whole cluster of practices that I think are operating from with very different motives for how their work can function. So this is the left side of that, and this, and I'll see if you buy this. But my take on it is that a lot of digital practice right now you can read some of it in terms of at least three waves of interest. And in 1999, Greg Lynn published Animate Form. I think in those early years of the digital, the biological parallel with digital possibility was incredibly important. And actually, the whole generic discussion of blob architecture is, to me, a kind of metaphorical grasping at biology as a kind of parallel or inspiration for what we could do with these new tools. And I actually think that exploration was polarized in really useful ways by a practice called Coulter and McDonald in New York that actually did a great installation in our gallery you can take out that literally looks like dentures, like enormous teeth. And all of their work looks like enormous skeletal structures. It is all orthopedic. Whereas our very own Hernan, I think, is at the relative extreme of the interest in biomorphic questions. He jokes routinely that his studios are about one creature or another. But to take his joke at a deeper level, I think Hernan's work is a sustained exploration of how biomimicry can inform contemporary architecture. Whether you're looking at tissue, whether you're looking at whole organisms, you can scale that in a variety of ways, but I think it's an incredibly coherent and thoroughgoing kind of passion in his work, and he's certainly not alone in it. I think that spectrum is a kind of kind of the opening round of digital exploration in important ways. The second one, so Jesse Reiser and Monica, it is late, Nanako Umamoto published Atlas of Novel Tectonics in 2006. This, for my generation, was actually an incredibly important publication. This was, for many of us that hadn't been schooled in the digital, this seemed like where we could get in on the game. This actually, it kind of made sense. They were trying to look at how digital formal generation could be applied and realized at the scale of building. And I actually think, in retrospect, that what the Atlas of Novel Tectonics taps into is a shift from the interest in life sciences and biology to a fascination with the earth sciences, geology, hydrology, actual phenomena that happen at something like the scale of a building. So you can build a building that looks like a landform. You can go to Joshua Tree and you can see rocks that could be, and that direct scalar parallel and the degree to which the earth sciences provide a really clear kind of applicable metaphor for what you can do with advanced geometric permutation. I think it was very important in that second wave. And I think it is really strongly represented in our faculty by Georgina and Marcelo at the more geological end of the spectrum, and by Tom Wiscombe at the more hydrological, or, and this would tap into that earlier diagram where I said, I just see a lot of architects interested in fluidity. This is, in a certain sense, an attempt to kind of flesh out or diversify that idea of 5 or 7 years ago. And then finally, you get at least a third wave of digital possibilities that correlate roughly with Greg Lynn's second form, which was published in 2011. And here, Florencia, you're caught here, but I think there's been a lot of work by SCI-Arc faculty and others that's looking at a very different model of science into architecture. And here, I don't have a nomenclature for this yet, but what led me to this was a collective interest in chromatic coding that I saw in that turn. When you and Greg worked on that proposal with Gary it was actually, I think, in Indonesia it was a kind of floral urban plan. Color came into effect in a really profound way, but what I realized was that color was almost always, the use of color was a little like a thermal spectrum. It was like a thermal mapping or something. It was color as a kind of a spectral code or something. And I do think that the interest in color at SCI-Arc, and you can go through your instructors by how much they do or don't, leave the monochrome, I think it's headed in that direction, or in something a little bit different in the work of Marcelin Gao and, before your time, Michel Cretes, who started to look at the electronic and how new technologies and the direct technological application of communication technology in particular could in fact become spatial or could drive spatial formations. And that one for me was really inspired by Marcelin's studio a couple years ago on LACMA, where she started to use randomized robotic programming to kind of bore out new interiors for museums. I actually think that lower right corner has a lot to do with robotics. All right, I'm gonna. What? Now make a color diagram of that? This is why this and my color blindness are why I can't. But this is the other side of that equation. And I think there are a whole bunch of people at SCI-Arc and otherwise who actually aren't chasing the dialogue between architecture and science with the same kind of focus that those practices I just mentioned are. I think many of them are interested in it in profound ways, but I think most of them would explain their work more in terms of their values and priorities and how it relates to a worldview that they see their architecture as an expression of a worldview, which actually both of these positions, architecture in dialogue with science and as an expression of philosophy, are at least as old as modernism, probably as old as the Renaissance. But this side of the equation is a little bit different, and for what it's worth, I think these are a few of the directions that goes, and just to tip my hand, I think I'm up in that corner. I think Andy Zago, who I guess had a real serious accident, but Andy and my friendship with Andy Zago is largely over my sense that we're at a shared kind of literalism and nominalism are related philosophical traditions in the sense that in the literal, you literally take something and make it what you need it to be. So this is a famous kind of, in the same way that less is more is a Misesian mantra, this is accredited to Donald Judd and other minimalist artists who literally just took something, and Dan Flavin's a good example, where a fluorescent light becomes the art. This has simply made that. And actually, nominalism is related to that in the sense that it has to do with how you determine art through a process of naming. So this is not a pipe is a famous title of a Magritte painting. It is not a pipe, and neither is Marcel Duchamp's urinal a urinal anymore. Both are works of art, for better or for worse. And that nominalist that alchemy of naming is something that I'm really interested in. Phenomenology is, and then the phenomenology is actually the closest to SCI-Arc's kind of process-obsessed origins. And phenomenologists, and actually I've got this slogan wrong, it should be "this is how it feels." Like phenomenologists would argue that you don't need to talk about things, you need to experience them. The work should simply be an expression of that ongoing experience. And if any of you caught Patrick Tye's installation a few years ago, it was a profoundly phenomenological exercise in the gallery where until you spent 15 minutes in this kind of textured cone that he created, you couldn't really start to come to terms with what he was trying to communicate as his interest in architecture. And then the pragmatism, I think, is relatively straightforward, or always presents itself as that, as a kind of ingenious solution to a problem. And I think I like this pairing because I don't think of Wes Jones and Peter Zellner in the same breath that often, but I think they are both profoundly pragmatic characters. Okay, this is the last one. And this one I offer, this is a diagram that I would suggest at the end of this semester, I think you guys should want to be close to a diagram like this. And what this was a diagram I put together pretty early in a book project I did a few years ago called Corrections and Collections. Corrections and Collections, Architectures for Art and Crime. Corrections and Collections. Please go buy it. Corrections and Collections, Architectures for Art and Crime was a study of museums and of prisons, which turned out to be these anchoring institutions in American urban renewal. But what sustained my interest in it, and I got interested in it because of prisons, and actually the degree to which prisons are often organized a lot like these diagrams are. But what sustained my interest in it really was art and architecture. And what I tried to do in this diagram was start to correlate the architecture for art with the kind of art that might have housed it and the kind of reasons that might have led to it. So that minimalism, for example, happens both in art and architecture. Emphatically, but for different reasons and by different actors. And what I tried to do here was show how a whole wave of contemporary museums correlated with different artists. And this one, what I ended up with was a dyad here based on Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, who I hope are familiar characters for you. There's an amazing show at the Hammer right now on the Black Mountain College, which was this incredible kind of post-Bauhaus flowering of creativity in the 40s and 50s. It's where Robert Rauschenberg really finds his footing as an artist. You should go see that. But this diagram had to do with, like, if there's a difference between Johns and Rauschenberg, can you start to read contemporary art through the lens of that difference? And if so, can you start to look at the museums in different ways? So I think as you guys are headed into thesis, I would encourage you to try to kind of see what you're interested in, both in terms of the projects and protagonists, and maybe how they both build on an architectural set of questions and how they pull other possibilities into them. I think that's my pitch. That's a house in Marin. My pleasure. I don't know. With questions after lectures, either if I don't have one on my mind, I don't want anyone to, and if I do, I often regret it. But as I said, I really do. As Florencia sort of made clear, I have a weirdly diversified experience of SCI-Arc, not necessarily an expert or well-informed one, but I've been here a while and in different guises. I really hope, and it's funny, I mean, I guess I have a question I'd ask you to lead off a little bit. You know, that first slide of thesis options and endgames, I don't think that applies anymore, but I'm kind of wondering what you're hoping to get out of it at this point, or if thesis was an incredibly anchoring experience. It was a defining experience for students at the school, and actually an institutionally defining kind of body of work each year. I don't know if that's necessarily the role it still plays. I also, okay, this is a question I'd ask. Do you see Thesis as a dialogue with a specific sensibility or an instructor here, or do you see it as a move out of SCI-Arc's discussions in some ways?
Hopefully both, yeah. I think, as you say, it's still a very defining moment for SCI-Arc, because I think as students, we really have the power in Thesis to also engage in a dialogue with the instructors and maybe sometimes even push them in a specific direction. And I feel like the instructors are open to that, to really engage with us. So in that way, that's where it kicks off and it becomes something outside of SCI-Arc, both for the student and for the instructor. So hopefully it can be a process which develops both the professor and the student.
I hope that's the case, and I think often it is. I mean, I feel like Thesis, you know, one of the, and there's a point at which I wouldn't want to add much pressure to the Thesis semesters, but it's early enough where I'm going to right now. A good thesis is the beginning of a career. A bad thesis won't end a career, but a good one will start it. And really thinking through what you know, it's sort of an opening salvo of your priorities in the field. And where you hope to take them. I mean, there have been a lot of really good failed theses. You know, where an idea was maybe too ambitious to get realized within that time frame, but that set up, as Eisenman would say, a project, something that you can pursue for your life. It feels. I'm living in Indonesia now. You guys want to hear some Jakarta stories?
I think that's I don't know. We mostly use this not to hear us, so we can keep a record and send it to the students that were not here, and to keep it as a record for thesis. But one of my recommendations would be for you guys, almost like to take a model. You know, we'll make the PowerPoint available with your approval, to really take a model and somehow readapt it to your framing, you know, or to your research right now. I mean, there's something quite interesting is that to your question of how the instructors here build up, you know, some theses build up on ongoing research. But I think what is interesting from your diagrams is that you frame that within a much larger context. You know, in a way, sometimes you guys are within within a certain, let's say, branch of the work, but don't see the tree. It's like almost like your work has been very focused, maybe even working throughout your 3 years or 2 years here with certain, you know, types of work, research, or methods, and even techniques. But I think that what is interesting from Joe's lecture for me is that, you know, you need a moment, and I think that's thesis prep, where you zoom out to see the whole tree and almost to see where it came from and what are the, you know, what came before, how can you frame it conceptually, even if you frame it wrong, you know, so not maybe a failed thesis, but a little bit kind of more kind of general. And I like also your point at the beginning between the general and the specific. Like you can have two diagrams. It seems a little bit overwhelming and in need of so much knowledge in the way that, you know, that, I don't know, I don't want to ask you, but how long one diagram would take to kind of build up. But this idea that you have a general diagram and then you have a specific one, which is kind of your summer thesis, which has to do with the operations, that has to do, you know, a little bit like the 5 points, Le Corbusier. I mean, it's like, it's that specific. It has to do with maybe from the 5 points, you go to 1 point. So that specific, the kind of, that specific diagram, and you call it, let me see my notes, the exo and the endo diagrams. I think that was a great point. Yeah.
But I think you guys will end up in a kind of an endogrammatic mode sometime pretty soon. And that actually, the question I want to ask you, and I'm hoping when I'm back in June and hopefully get to see what, I guess I'll probably get to see the work that ends up in the gallery at the end of the semester. But my wager would be that those are the ones where the endo diagramming was strong and novel and really tried to kind of take. And I do think getting a sense for who you hope to be in dialogue with will help you sharpen what you try to say through your work and the devices you bring to bear on that. But I hope, I think one of the things I was thinking driving across town this afternoon was that for me, this feels like a kind of 60% conversation, 60% of your kind of thesis research work, and 60% of our getting ready for the show. But the next 40%, how, from my point of view, the other 40% of this conversation would be about both the translation and the diversification and the kind of sharpening of those diagrams that really drive architectural innovation, the more endo than exo side of it. But for the moment, the one thing I would say too about the specific and the general, usually I get to the general from the specific. Like most of the time, I don't give myself a big general, like the most general diagrams in this, like the contemporary Japanese architecture, that's a very general diagram at this point, but it really started from that one on the show with these houses, and first trying to make sense of the work that came in through that show, and then feeling like I didn't know enough about Japanese architecture and needed to figure out where they came from, and you kind of work your way back. And similarly, for all the ones, most of them start, and I would encourage you to take your instincts and your appetites seriously and try to read them for symptoms and diagnoses. I don't think you actually need to decide what universe you want to operate in. If there's a star you like, it'll lead you to figure out more about that universe. And that's kind of, whether it's a building or an architect or something outside of that, or a philosophical question. I mean, it can be almost anything, but actually defining things rather sharply will help you broaden your. It's funny, it's advice I got on writing from Mike Davis. I was teaching with Mike a couple years out. As I finished SCI-Arc, I was Mike's TA. And I asked him a little bit about writing, and he said, my basic approach to an article is find a really specific example of something, find a specific story, flesh it out in a compelling way, and then read the echoes of it as it broadens into a more general phenomena. And I actually think it's advice that carries in design as well in some ways.
I wanted to point out another thing you said about the slide table, this idea of the cartography, which has to do with that, and it might be like that single image or that close-up that starts the cartography, but then it builds up a...
Yeah. And we had 2 or 3 weeks of those images just floating around and trying to find, like you find clues. Like we found one of these projects, a pretty cool, very blank house in Tokyo that had been shot that resembled and had been photographed exactly like Frank Gehry's Danziger studio, a very early project of his on Beverly. And all of a sudden we had one of the youngest people in Japan really closely echoing one of the most established architects here. And then we kind of built off of that. It turned out that project had everything had been milled into this incredible. There was this sort of incredible patina of figure ground at a close read of that building. It wasn't Danziger all over, but it was. I don't know. You find things like that, and they help build. And I do think that kind of slide table your appetites for what you want to do with thesis, and it might cure you of some of them. And I think, frankly, a lot of thesis projects end up a little bit prey to fashion. And with that, what you'll get, I mean, honestly, that diagram is on some levels a mood board. And getting your interests clear and visible and present so that they don't kind of haunt you and simply become your project unconsciously is valuable.
Okay. Any further or final questions?
Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much.